Blog Talk Radio.
Good evening. Welcome to The View Up Here. I'm your host, Canadian Glenn. I hope you can hear me. And it's January 17th, 2018. Anybody in the chat room or on Twitter, let me know this damn thing's working. But regardless, NAFTA or no NAFTA? That seems to be the question. Can Canada actually leave and be okay? Well, the North American Free Trade Agreement's been around since 1994 between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. Created the biggest economic trading bloc in the world. And it was the first multinational trade liberalization agreement, becoming a role model for everything that's come after. Nobody knew what ISDS was or NAFTA. For 23 years, it's been in effect. Canadian governments. Excellent. Sound works. Thank you very much for the update. What was that? Canadian government, Chretien, Martin, Harper, Trudeau. They've all gone along with it. They fought an arbitration, both for and against. No Canadian government has ever said we should leave. Mexican government, Salinas, Zedillo, bloc, Calderon, Nieto, they've all seen Mexico have massive overall improvements in the nation's economy and its health. Mexico is not looking to go anywhere. The American governments of Clinton, Bush, and Obama stuck with it. Although it could be said that the United States have suffered the biggest loss out of all three. Well, what's changed? Well, you know, that president down there. Worst deal ever. Really. Well, numbers don't prove that, but, you know, whatever. We're in a Trump world now. Proclamations don't carry much force. Personal opinions don't change trade agreements. There's an awful lot of individual U.S. states. Their number one export market is Canada. And most of those states are Republican. We'll see what happens. Will NAFTA get renegotiated? Does it deserve to be? Well, it's 23 years old. I'm sure, you know, it is lacking on things like digital property, digital rights, copyrights, this sort of thing. It could use an updating. But, you know, to get the phrase that if it's not a good deal for the Donald, it's not going to happen. That ain't how shit works. But what are we going to talk about tonight? We're going to talk about the people who are involved in these negotiations. You don't really even know who they are. Canadians, how many people can you name that are on this NAFTA renegotiation team besides Chrystia Freeland? It's the same thing for the Americans and the Mexicans. We're going to take a look at these people who are negotiating this agreement, or renegotiating, sorry. Then we'll look at what the demands are for renegotiation. That spans from the United States, that put out a list of objectives with over 100 items. Mexico really, they're like, yeah, okay, this part, yeah, we could look at that, we could look at this, but there's no big agenda or list for Mexico. Canada, well, it's much shorter than the U.S. list, but there definitely are some things on it. And we'll look at where politics, domestic, are playing into all this. I just throw in what's something that happened today. Andrew Scheer, Lisa Raitt, other conservatives are in Washington, and they are presenting a united front and saying, we are here negotiating and having discussions as Canada. They're not going to undercut the Liberals. So, things are getting serious. In 2016, the total amount of trade in the NAFTA region, the United States, Canada, and Mexico, was very close to $1 trillion US. Now, from when it started in 1994 to 2016, that's an annual growth rate average of 5.5% a year. Now, if you want to talk Mexico-Canada trade, that average annual rate of growth was 9.8%, and Mexico-U.S. total trade, it's 7.7%. Those are big increases. A NAFTA modernization process should include a lot of things: new trade-related issues, e-commerce, the unicorn-like support for small and medium-sized businesses, update rules that need it, and handling issues like trade deficits through trade expansion, opening markets to try and balance out deficit numbers. But what everybody has to remember about NAFTA is the three partners, they're not just simply selling things to one another. Automotives is a perfect example. Within NAFTA now, all three partners make things together. So it makes sense to enhance and improve the cross-border supply chain. Now, Mexican exports to the U.S. market contain 40% U.S. content. It's back and forth. Canadian exports to the U.S. contain 25% U.S. content. Now, the NAFTA agreement gives consumers a basket of options. It also gives the options to industries, agriculture, agribusiness, in terms of quality, variety, availability, and price. The three partners have also entrenched the integration of the three economies in technological development, production processes, and standardization. So, I mean, to put it simply, rolling back what's been accomplished is not going to help anybody with where the rest of the world is these days. Now, that little bit of information came from something on policyoptions.irpp.org, just outlining the NAFTA challenges. It was written by Yvonne Stinson-Ortiz, and it's part of the Trade Policy for Uncertain Times series. Now, as I said, there's been a lot of talk over the more than 20 years of this agreement. There's been an awful lot said in our entire time about jobs, job loss. All the jobs went to Mexico. Well, there was a lot of job loss. But what's never mentioned enough that I just want to get out there right off the bat, automation and streamlining of processes and flat out productivity would have delivered an awful lot of the same numbers for job losses. As I said, we're going to talk about people who are actually representing the countries at the table, who they're influenced by, who they listen to, who's in on it, who's not. Because really, I haven't seen anything about stuff like this. Like, who's making these discussions? Who's at the table? Who gets to say yes or no to certain parts? Who gets to say we what? Nobody's talking about these people and their connection. Firstly, I want to say this is your guide to the players and priorities that matter. NAFTA negotiations. This is from opencanada.org. Really good background pieces. I have one for each country from them. I'm going to start with Team Canada. Now, Open Canada says Team Canada is well prepared with firm priorities. And with the chief negotiators of the TPP, which is not dead yet, and CETA, both playing central roles in the NAFTA renegotiation, Canada has put its best people on the job. But who are they? Chrystia Freeland. Normally, Canada's Minister of International Trade, François-Philippe Champagne, would be the lead for free trade agreements, but not when it involves the United States. Freeland, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs, is leading the negotiation team for Canada in NAFTA renegotiation. Why her? Well, she knows America better than most Canadian cabinet ministers. She worked for Thomson Reuters in New York, covered banking, trade, and the economy. And to say she knows the file well would be an understatement. Now, her main role will be to stay in regular communication with Canada's chief negotiator, Steve Verhal, and relay anything important to the Prime Minister. She will also oversee the NAFTA Advisory Council and speak to the media when needed. Kirsten Hillman. Last August, Canada got something it never had before, a deputy ambassador to the United States in Washington. Not just an honorary position. Kirsten Hillman is a trade veteran, and it's another sign that the Liberal government are taking these negotiations very seriously. When it comes to trade and foreign affairs, there may be no one more experienced than Hillman. He was Canada's chief negotiator on the TPP and most recently served as an assistant deputy minister at Global Affairs, where she helped the CETA ratification process. One of the main pluses of having her on the team is that she already knows the personalities Canada will be dealing with and the issues they'll be discussing. Many of the provisions talked about for a few years in the TPP negotiations will likely pop up again here. Steve Verhal. There may be no more challenging a job than being Canada's chief NAFTA negotiator. If anybody's up to it, it's Steve Verhal. He's a longtime negotiator, plenty of experience hammering out major trade deals. He was Canada's chief negotiator for CETA, Canada's chief agricultural negotiator from 2003 to 2009, and even had a hand in the original NAFTA when he worked at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. Two things make him the right person for the job. He can handle the pressure, and he has a history of bringing numerous sides together. Now, just like CETA, there are many interests that must be taken into account during negotiations. Most industries have something at stake here, while certain requests that the U.S. and Mexico may make would fall under provincial jurisdiction in Canada, not federal. That's something that's different about us. Steve Verhul will be liaising with Minister Freeland and Kirsten Hillman, talking to businesses and NGOs, and overseeing a large domestic negotiating team as well. David Usher is the Director General of Trade Negotiations at Global Affairs Canada. So he has the task of gathering information from provinces, federal departments, and anybody else who has a stake in this process from Canada's seat. Usher is a former ambassador to Ethiopia. He's represented Canada at the WTO, also at OPEC meetings, and has held numerous trade-related roles. He likely won't be in Washington. He'll be back in Ottawa setting up meetings, relaying information, being a nexus of sorts. Kendall Hembroff. Usher will be talking to the country's various trade teams. Kendall Hembroff will be doing yeoman's work, asking academics for their input, gathering economists' opinions, and dealing with interdepartmental trade teams more face-to-face. She's a director at Global Affairs Canada, been working there since 2000, moving up the ladder steadily. She will be reporting to David Usher. As I said, Canada's provinces have a role to play here, unlike the US or Mexico. Most provinces have a trade team, with the bigger ones having chief negotiators. Raymond Bachar, Quebec's former finance minister, is that province's top negotiator. Janet Quiring is BC's top negotiator. It'll be their job and the other provincial teams to work with Usher and the rest of Verhul's group to get their positions heard. Of course, the business community will be involved. They don't have a direct seat at the negotiating table, but some organizations, such as the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters, could be down the hall in another room, waiting for paper copies to come and then, write in the margins, send them back. Some larger corporations, most likely multinationals, ones that may be more directly impacted by any changes to trade, could have their executives, shall we say, in the building as well. Who else is on Canada's team? Well, not everybody's aware of the next couple. Rona Ambrose. Now, one of Minister Freeland's more astute moves, considered by most, was putting former Conservative cabinet minister and leader of the opposition, also newly appointed global fellow of the DC-based Wilson Center, Rona Ambrose. He is on the advisory council. Ambrose is well respected in her party, from Alberta, and that's seen as some sort of, a symbol for the West. Hey, you're not left out. To go a little further on that and to get a little further down the ladder, James Moore, Ride Me Wilfred, is also on the council, representing apparently the Conservative voice in British Columbia. And of course, the last one where the buck stops is with the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. In some ways, he's the most important person. He's the one who will sign off whenever that may be. Usually presidents and prime ministers stand mostly on the sidelines, letting everyone else do the difficult work. With this negotiation, though, Trudeau may be busier than usual. And that would have to do with the President of the United States. Now, where does Trudeau come into the process as it's being negotiated? Well, for example, if the United States takes a hard line on, say, Chapter 19, which is possible, Minister Freeland will ask the Prime Minister if he wants to step away from the table or go forward. So they do have a deep team, but they are sending the message that executive authority, Prime Minister. I think that makes sense. I don't think you do it any other way in a negotiation like this. What about Team Mexico? Well, title from OpenCanada.org is Trepidation Turns to Cautious Optimism. Now, Mexico outlined its objectives for NAFTA renegotiations last August 1st. Their priorities include modernizing it to incorporate digital and energy issues, and they'll also seek to maintain investor protections and introduce anti-graft measures. Mexico has concerns with rules of origin regulations and Trump's talk of trade deficits. It also wants to keep trade free rather than managed, and would like to keep intact Chapter 19, the dispute resolution mechanism. Now, who's on Team Mexico? Luis Videgaray. In early January, President Enrique Peña Nieto tapped his closest political confidant, Luis Videgaray, to manage Mexico's relationship with the Trump administration by appointing him Foreign Relations Secretary. Now, the easy choice for Peña Nieto. His history with Videgaray dates back more than a decade. Videgaray managed Nieto's 2012 presidential campaign and served as finance minister from 2012 to 2016. He's an MIT-trained economist. He has earned some plaudits so far, especially for his handling of President Trump. Pundits suggested he was picked for this lead position on Team Mexico because of his relationship with Trump's son-in-law and advisor, Jared Kushner. As a sign of the importance of NAFTA negotiations, or an indication of the time it may take to reach a deal, Videgaray ruled himself out as a presidential hopeful in 2018 because he would have to exit government by the beginning of 2017. Well, negotiations are still ongoing. Geronimo Gutierrez, the new ambassador to the United States, is a friend from University of Videgaray, and he was once head of the North American Development Bank, which funds water, environmental, and infrastructure projects in U.S. and Mexican border states. Gutierrez is an old hand on U.S. relations. He served as Undersecretary for North America in the Vicente Fox administration from 2003 to 2006. While overseeing the San Antonio, Texas-based NAD Bank, analysts say he developed relationships which may prove profitable in the NAFTA negotiations. Now, Gutierrez was the fourth Mexican ambassador to Washington in 4 years. A show of neglect in what is Mexico's most important international relationship. But it seems that Nieto thinks that he has the right man in place now. Ildefonso Gallardo. Now, whereas Videgaray is overseeing the political parts of NAFTA, Gallardo is the point person for dealing with the domestic constituencies impacted by NAFTA. He's an economist by training and politician with the PRI, the Party of Government in Mexico. He headed Mexico's Free Trade Office in its embassy in Washington in the early 1990s. Diminutive and diplomatic, Gallardo has often appeared in Mexican and foreign media to rebut Trump's tweets and tirades targeting Mexico, often playing the bad cop to Videgaray's good cop when dealing with statements from the U.S. Kenneth may have an Anglo name, but Gallardo described Mexico's chief technical negotiator as Super Mexican. At the age of 48, Smith is already seen as a veteran on trade issues. U.S. educated, Smith entered the government in 1993 and worked as International Affairs Coordinator for the Agriculture Ministry. He now heads the Trade and Representation Office in Washington for the Economy Secretariat. People who know Smith Ramos describe him as knowing his way around the U.S. Capitol and very familiar with his counterparts in the Office of the United States Trade Representative, USTR. Mexico's private sector has consulted closely on negotiations, which is represented by the Consejo Coordinador Empresarial. Wow, I'm not Spanish. That's a Chamber of Commerce. Mexico is a country where the private sector is being consulted every step of the way in negotiations. This doesn't happen in other places. Well, it does. They just don't publicly say it too often. You know. Ooh, there's people in the chat room. Hi, people. The script is, are you still asking, Penny? Oh, no, you got it worked out? The script is slowing Firefox. That means it's taking way too long to load. That's what that's about. So either you got a slow connection or you got a lot of bandwidth being used or BTO sucks. Hello, everybody. Sorry. I've just been reading here and I was on a different page. Hello, Graham. Hello, Penny. Peekaboo, I know who you are. Hi. One on Team Mexico is Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador. He's a big deal in these negotiations, even though he won't have a seat at the table. He is a left-wing populist and two-time electoral runner-up. In Mexican media, he is simply called AMLO, which is an anagram of his initials. He leads polls for the 2018 presidential elections in Mexico. His proximity to power spooks Mexico's political and business classes, along with international investors. We like to compare him to Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. But AMLO says no, sorry. There are a lot of people that are worried about AMLO in the background. But he certainly is bringing a different viewpoint to a domestic situation. You know, I just mentioned that the conservative leadership is in Washington right now. They will not speak against the Trudeau government in negotiations. They said they would only do it on Canadian soil. This is exactly what AMLO is doing. Now, AMLO bitterly opposed the structural reforms promoted by Peña Nieto and compared opening the state-run energy sector to treason. If he wins the election, he will put that energy reform to a referendum. And that is an issue. It's been a big deal in Mexico for a couple years. Econimic was privatized. That is the story with Team Mexico. The last note is a renegotiated NAFTA with any major changes would go to Mexico's Congress for approval, which would likely be a formality. The ruling PRI party holds an effective majority in the lower house and could count on support from the right-leaning National Action Party in the Senate, allowing it to reach a two-thirds majority. So far, Team Canada, Team Mexico, these are the most experienced people they have. They're taking it seriously. There's no doubt about it. What about Team United States? OpenCanada.org's title for Team US is Focused on Reducing Trade Deficit. That regional trade has more than tripled since NAFTA went into effect in 1994. U.S. President Donald Trump has notoriously called NAFTA the worst trade deal ever negotiated. While a rising trade deficit from 2000 to 2010 coincided with the loss of almost 6 million U.S. manufacturing jobs, economists lay those losses at the feet of not trade, but increased automation and the adoption of advanced productivity-enhancing technology. This is something that people in the U.S., in the academic circles especially, are making a big deal out of before this goes too far with the rhetoric of bringing jobs back. We've already seen it with the Carrier plant, with GM. We've seen it with a few already. Trump promises, look at the jobs that are staying, and they're gone. It's just like Harper with Electromotive in London, Ontario. Same crock of shit. The Trump administration has said labor and environmental obligations will be renegotiated. And people expect both areas to be elevated from the existing side agreements to full chop in a renegotiated NAFTA, which would give the provisions more clout. Labor leaders are pushing for stronger grievance procedures and wage protections, as well as heightened workplace inspection protocols. The overarching objective announced by the USTR is reducing the U.S. trade deficit. Given that the U.S. has a trade surplus with Canada of almost $8 billion U.S., this essentially implies a focus on reducing the $63 billion deficit with Mexico. Now, right off the bat, a lot of objective observers said that this is a joke. Why would Canada and Mexico both agree to accept larger deficits in order to reduce the U.S. deficit? Now, Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross built his $2.5 billion fortune buying and restructuring failed companies. As Trump's point man on international trade, he seems to think U.S. trade policy needs a similar turnaround. Ross has been vocal about what he sees as shortcomings of past trade agreements, complaining that the U.S., with a 2016 trade deficit of $504 billion, has absorbed the trade surplus of the rest of the world. He argues for narrowing U.S. trade deficits by forcing other countries to buy more American goods and services in exchange for access to the large U.S. market. The Commerce Secretary worked closely with Mexican Economy Minister Ildefonso Guajardo earlier this year to hammer out an agreement on the sugar trade in a process that bodes well for our long-term relationship. The deal averted the imposition of duties and limited Mexican imports that U.S. producers had complained undercut their business. The process suggests Ross's perspective, which will carry much weight with the negotiating team, to be more focused on trade's impact on big producers than its impact on the U.S. economy as a whole. Whether Trump's threat to withdraw from NAFTA was a real possibility or simply a negotiating tactic, there was one indication of Peter Navarro's hardline influence on trade policy. Navarro, whose economic expertise is in utilities, not trade, has argued that trade is the world's central problem, especially trade with China, and that global prosperity isn't possible until trade is fixed. He views trade with nations such as China and Mexico as a zero-sum game, in which any gains on their part come at the expense of the U.S. Many economists view Navarro's reducing trade deficit ideas at best as simplistic and at worst as a dangerous precursor to possible trade wars. Robert Lighthizer and John Mell. Robert Lighthizer has been down this road before. The U.S. Trade Representative handled trade talks with Japan as Deputy U.S. Trade Rep in Reagan's administration, winning concessions on steel imports through a blunt and sometimes hard-headed style. But Lighthizer's approach could be balanced by career diplomat John Mell, the assistant USTR tapped to handle day-to-day negotiations. With almost 30 years of experience in the USTR office, Mel has worked with Mexico on NAFTA-related issues for years, as well as handling other trade disputes with Canada and Latin America. The relationships he's developed over those years could help smooth the way to finding common ground. From 1985 until his appointment as United States Trade Representative head this year, Lighthizer had worked at New York-based law firm Skadden, Arps, Mahar, and Flom, doing the kind of spade work he has argued the U.S. should do more of, bringing trade complaints on behalf of U.S. companies, such as U.S. Steel, in various international forums. Thanks to his work as chief counsel to the Senate Finance Committee from 1978 to 1983, Lighthizer has also experienced at moving deals through Congress, a key constituency due to its constitutional authority over trade. The USTR is Congress's main point of contact on trade policy, a role that could test Lighthizer's skills of persuasion. Now, Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue played a key role in averting Trump's plan to withdraw from NAFTA already. When he and Ross met with the president to try and change his mind, Perdue brought along a map showing the areas of the country that would suffer the worst job losses, culture, and manufacturing from such a move. Many of them were full of counties that had just voted for Trump in November. This is when President Trump decided to renegotiate rather than withdraw. And I believe in the slideshow, you're going to see a map that pretty much demonstrates that. I can't be sure of the number off the top of my head, but I believe it's more than 35 states in the United States has Canada as its #1 export destination. U.S. farm exports to Mexico have soared from about $4 billion in 1994 to $18.5 billion in 2017, a total of $40 billion when Canada is included. And the agriculture industry in the U.S. is keen to protect those gains. That's why farm groups and the red state governors and senators that represent their members have kept the heat on the administration to stay hands off on the provisions of the agreement that affect agricultural interests. Now, the U.S. Constitution gives Congress authority over international trade. In recent years, senators and House members have effectively ceded some of that authority to the executive branch, but it was on a case-by-case basis, and that stance has begun to change. Congress takes its oversight of the trade function extremely seriously, and lawmakers will likely be watching the negotiations very closely. This is, I think, the most important difference between the teams in Canada and Mexico as compared to the United States. With Canada and Mexico, we're being presented with a team. And the president of Mexico and the prime minister of Canada aren't in the picture all the time. That's not so much what you get if you listen to what the United States is saying. Lighthizer is in charge, but he doesn't make any calls, apparently. The way it's being presented, it's all up to the president. Yeah, that sounds just awesome, doesn't it now? Yeah, just give me a second, trying to clean up everything here. We're going to talk about blocks and the consequences and stuff like that. So those are the teams. So, I mean, we got a lot of professionals, and a lot of these people have experience with each other personally in negotiation. I think it's very important. It should be mentioned at least once by the corporate media. Like, these people know each other. Everybody shouldn't shit their pants. Whatever. The next thing we're going to look at is the objectives of the renegotiation. I'm going to try and go through them in order as they came out. Of course, this whole renegotiation is because Washington wants it. The United States came out with their objectives first, July 17, 2017, over 100 items, a table of contents, 18 pages. I'm going to spare you the introduction because all it is the USTR putting a cover letter on that says, "Oh my God, we are so emboldened with our great leader who's going to make America great again, blah, 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 blah. Gee, we've only been doing this since, 94. Thank God somebody finally showed up so we know what the hell we're doing." This is complete propaganda. Trade in goods, industrial goods, agricultural goods, the bulk, the things that people buy, that they eat, that they consume, that they use. Trade in goods. A very detailed explanation of what the U.S. wants to accomplish is improve the U.S. trade balance and reduce the trade deficit with the NAFTA countries. Thanks for all that detail. With industrial goods, they want to maintain existing, promote greater regulatory compatibility. Translation to that is make your laws like ours. Agricultural goods, maintain existing, expand competitive market opportunities for U.S. agricultural goods in NAFTA countries, substantially equivalent to the competitive opportunities afforded foreign exports into the U.S. market by reducing or eliminating remaining tariffs. Doesn't that sound very, structured, understandable? What it means is it wants Canada to do away with supply management. That's all that means. Seek to eliminate non-tariff barriers to U.S. agricultural exports, including discriminatory barriers, restrictive administration of tariff rate quotas, other unjustified measures that unfairly limit access to markets for U.S. goods, such as cross-subsidization, price discrimination, and price undercutting. That is supply management. Again, asking for make your laws like ours. Customs, trade facilitation, rules of origin. Rules of origin is something that is going to be a big deal in this. The U.S. wants to update and strengthen the rules of origin as necessary to ensure that the benefits of NAFTA go to products genuinely made in the United States and North America. Ensure the rules of origin incentivize the sourcing of goods and materials from the United States and North America. See a pattern here? Trade in services, including telecommunications and financial services. Secure commitments from NAFTA countries to provide fair and open conditions for services trade, including through rules that apply to all services sectors, including rules that prohibit discrimination against foreign services suppliers, restrictions on the number of services suppliers in the market, and requirements that cross-border services suppliers first establish a local presence. Does everybody hear what that says? What the U.S. wants is, let's talk about, say, telecom in Canada. This says that there can be absolutely no restriction to any of the U.S. telecom providers entering Canada. You can't limit how many competitors there are. And you can't tell us that we have to have a head office in Canada. That's a big departure. Telecommunications. Promote competitive supply of telecommunication services by facilitating market entry through transparent regulation and an independent regulator. Independent regulator. With no definition. Okay, so if it's not going to be a tribunal, like say, that a representative from each of the two countries involved and one from the industry, just independent regulator. What does that mean? No idea. Secure commitments to provide reasonable network access for telecommunication suppliers through interconnection and access to physical facilities and scarce resources. So what that says is the Verizons and the AT&Ts want it written into NAFTA that the Teluses and the Rogers and the Bells can't prevent them from using their backbone. Financial services. Expand competitive market opportunities for United States financial service suppliers to obtain fairer and more open conditions of financial services trade. Take down the walls. That's all that says. Ensure that the NAFTA countries refrain from imposing measures in the financial services sector that restrict cross-border data flows or that require the use or installation of local computing facilities. Couple things here. Okay, again, it's calling for no presence in the country. Not only can we have our head office in the States here while we invade your market, we can also stay here to collect all your data. Restrict cross-border data flow. That sounds like that could apply to an awful lot of things, don't you? Because let's keep in mind, agreements like NAFTA are nothing but a massive omnibus agreement. Digital trade in goods and services and cross-border data flow. Secure commitments not to impose customs duties on digital products. Establish rules to prevent governments from mandating the disclosure of computer source code. I'm really confused by this one. Prevent governments from mandating the disclosure of computer source code. I'm not sure if this relates to the intellectual property, copyright, protection of intelligence community. I'm not sure what that's about. And of course, there's no explanation. Investment. Secure for U.S. investors in the NAFTA countries important rights consistent with U.S. legal principles and practice, while ensuring that NAFTA country investors in the United States are not accorded greater substantive rights than domestic investors. Okay. So if Canadians or Mexicans want to come to the U.S., they play by the same rules as the Americans. Well, that's what we do in Canada too, except they don't like our laws. So why don't you just get laws like us? No, fuck off. Intellectual property. Promote adequate and effective protection of intellectual property rights, including through the following. Ensure accelerated and full implementation of the WTO agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. ensure provisions governing intellectual property rights reflect a standard of protection similar to that found in U.S. law. Don't tell us what kind of laws to make, okay? Transparency. Permit each NAFTA member to provide levels of transparency, participation, and accountability in the development of regulations and other government decisions that are comparable to those under U.S. law with respect to federal statutes and regulations. So in other words, just if you guys sign this agreement the way we want it, you're signing to make your laws along the lines of ours, and then we know all the rules we can exploit before we even get there. But we don't trust you. So we want you to commit to publishing all your consultation and development of statutes and regulations so we can keep an eye on you before it's even law. So if we don't like the direction you're going, you're going to see us in Ottawa. Seek standards to ensure that government regulatory reimbursement regimes are transparent, provide procedural fairness, are non-discriminatory, and provide full market access for United States products. Well, obviously, if they're asking for full access, they don't have it now. And if they don't have it now, we don't have it now. But I don't see them asking for everyone to have it, just them. Labor. A lot of people have been talking about renegotiating the labor section of NAFTA. The Americans say, bring the labor provisions into the core of the agreement rather than as a side agreement. Okay, that gives them more clout, but it also gives the member nations more authority to push on it. Now, the American position on paper looks very good, actually. Require NAFTA countries to adopt and maintain in their laws and practices the internationally recognized core labor standards as recognized in the ILO Declaration, including freedom of association and the effective recognition of the right to leave bargain, elimination of all forms of forced or compulsory labor, effective abolition of child labor and a prohibition on the worst forms of child labor, and elimination of discrimination in respect of employment and occupation. Lofty goals coming from the United States. Elimination of all forms of forced or compulsory labor. Well, I guess there goes the private prison industry. Somehow I don't see that happening. There's a very interesting clause here that's a little hard. It's written in legalese. This is establish rules that will ensure that NAFTA countries do not waive or derogate from their labor laws implementing internationally recognized core labor standards. So that means if your labor laws are already below the ILO Declaration, then you cannot implement them in a manner affecting trade or investment between the parties. So think about what that means. Oh yeah, well, you're going to have to upgrade. You got to get rid of all them sweatshops, man. Part of the deal. Oh, wait a minute. Those sweatshops are making product destined for the U.S. market, and you're owned by a U.S. multinational. Okay, well, that's all right then, because that would affect trade or investment between the parties. How convenient. Environment, they want to bring the environment provisions into the core. instead of a side agreement as it exists now. Again, it comes with the same pluses and minuses. Under trade remedies, preserve the ability of the United States to enforce rigorously its trade laws, including the anti-dumping duty, countervailing duty, and safeguard laws. Eliminate the NAFTA global safeguard exclusion so that it does not restrict the ability of the United States to apply measures in future investigations. Eliminate Chapter 19 dispute settlement mechanism. Establish transparency and due process obligations that are reflected in American anti-dumping duty and countervailing duty laws, regulations, and practice. So again, they want the same laws in Canada and Mexico as they have. Government procurement. Increase opportunities for U.S. firms to sell U.S. products and services into the NAFTA countries. This has been a sticking point on many different agreements. We gave it away on CETA. It was a big issue in TPP. Energy. Preserve and strengthen investment, market access, and state-owned enterprise disciplines benefiting energy production and transmission, and support North American energy security and independence, while promoting continuing energy market opening reforms. What does that translate to? I don't know. Drill, baby, drill. They want the environment to be part of the formal agreement, but they want absolutely nothing to slow down energy development. Provisions. This is a strange place for this one to end up. Include general exceptions that allow for the protection of legitimate U.S. domestic objectives, including the protection of health or safety and essential security, among others. So what does that mean? Does that mean if it's a U.S. national security issue, they don't have to pay any attention to this? You know, and if said national security issue just happens to involve a few $1 billion of investment or trade or product or, you know, like, yeah, whatever. Okay. The Mexico list, extremely short compared to the U.S. list, came out in July. Now, Mexico has come a long, long way since 1994. Again, I go back to the piece from Policy Options from Yvonne Stinson-Ortiz. Gives a little background on Mexico. Mexico is a highly diversified and stable economy and is one of the most open free trading nations in the world. In 2016, it was the most open economy in the G20. 12 free trade agreements across North America, Asia Pacific, Europe, Middle East, and Latin America. It's a member of the WTO, the OECD, and APEC. They're in every club they can be in. According to the Mexican Ministry of the Economy, Mexico's trade to GDP ratio has grown from 20% in the 1980s to 73% currently, which shows the importance of international trade to the economy. Mexico has transformed its export structure to become a global manufacturing powerhouse. In 1982, oil accounted for 70% of Mexico's total exports. In 2016, manufactured goods made up 89% of total exports. NAFTA has been a valuable tool for Mexico's trade policy. It has allowed Mexico to move from the simple exchange of goods to the building of a sturdy production platform that is highly integrated with the economies of the United States and Canada. Mexico's total trade with its NAFTA partners grew 452% from 1993, when the agreement was signed, to 2016. Its exports grew 604%, and more than 50% of total incoming foreign direct investment from 1999 to 2016 came from the US and Canada. Mexico's total trade share with its NAFTA partners was 30.9% in 1993. In 2016, it's 51%. Mexico will enter these talks with an approach that rests on three pillars. One, NAFTA has brought benefits for all three signatories. Two, there is always room for improvement. And three, the outcome must be a win-win-win for Mexico to agree to go along. Well, that's all noble and sounds very nice, but I would say Mexico has the most to lose. They are the ones with a huge trade surplus with the U.S. They are in the crosshairs. Since 1994 in Mexico, the gross national income per person has gone up 90%. And in Mexico, the national poverty rate has declined 69%. Those are real results. Mexico's trade, total trade, in 1993 was $117.3 billion. In 2016, it was $761 billion. There's your 650% increase. Its exports went in 93 from $51.9 billion to 2016, $373.9 billion. 720% increase. Their imports have also skyrocketed as the standard of living improves. More people are out of poverty. 1993, Mexico imported $65.4 billion. In 2016, it was $378.1 billion. 590%. Mexico has benefited. So they don't really have a long list. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Calderon. Oh, did I miss anything? I'll get to the differences between Chapter 11 and Chapter 19 once we get through the lists. We're going to get into the specific negotiation and where it's been going in Canada. We're going to get more domestic. I just wanted to cover the big picture, what everybody's looking for. What about Canada's demands? Well, Canada was the last to come out, August 14th. Minister Freeland, pretty straightforward list. Canada's looking for a new chapter on labor standards. I think it looks like the angle that Canada will be going for is to protect the freedom to unionize, at least on paper, and to try and increase wage floor in Mexico. If that's possible, I don't really know how. A new chapter on environmental standards. Now, again, the labor and environment were side agreements that Bill Clinton wanted put in when he took over from Bush 1. Now, Minister Freeland says she wants a chapter that ensures no country can weaken environmental protection to attract investment. And she said it should also support efforts against climate change. Isn't that a reflection of the world we live in? No country can weaken environmental protection to attract investment. You have to put this in an agreement. Unbelievable. Canada looks for a new chapter on gender rights. This is ground where the other two have not gone. A new chapter on indigenous rights. This has gotten support in Mexico from indigenous communities. This has gotten support in the United States from indigenous communities. It has got next to absolutely no mention at all in media. Reforms to the investor-state dispute settlement process. This is Chapter 11. Chapter 11 is ISDS, which involves corporations suing governments. Minister Freeland wants reform so that governments have an unassailable right to regulate in the public interest. To clarify a bit, Chapter 19 regulates disputes between companies over dumping. This is the softwood lumber ordeal, is Chapter 19. And Chapter 19 is what the United States wants to eliminate. So imagine what they could do to us on softwood lumber if Chapter 19 is eliminated. There is no process. Expand procurement. Now, for years, Canada has wanted to kill Buy American rules for construction projects at the state and local level, but that could be a very tough sell. U.S. lawmakers are demanding even more Buy American rules, which is something Trump campaigned on. Freeland said, local content provisions for major government contracts are political junk food, superficially appetizing, but unhealthy in the long run. Well, personally, I would have to differ with that. If your civic government, if your provincial/state government can't invest public money into local firms, that is a permanent deterioration of the tax base to facilitate large conglomerates. So on this one, Minister Freeland, pound sand. Freer movement of professionals. NAFTA includes a list of professions where people can easily get a visa to work across the border, but it's an old list. Some of the professions listed are land surveyor and range conservationist, but not computer programmers, IT engineering. International corporations, especially those which do business in all three countries of NAFTA, want the list expanded to make it easier for employees to move between offices. Minister Freeland has said that they will protect Canada's supply management system for dairy and poultry. Now, Canada does not have free trade in these areas. They regulate imports and prices. Now, Minister Freeland has told the International Trade Committee that her government is fully committed to defending supply management. Protect cultural exemptions. Canada insisted on protections in the old agreement for cultural industries, like publishing and broadcasting. Of course, the United States wants to see that removed. As a side comment, yes, those provisions have helped in some ways to guarantee Canadian content, availability of Canadian content, support of creation of Canadian content. But what it's also done, which not too many people are aware of, is it gives the federal government power to edit international periodicals that come into Canada. If there's information in it, especially regarding military matters or trade, Canadian editions will likely have the Canadian information, especially if it's negative, removed from the Canadian edition. I found this numerous times when looking for military information, especially as far as the F-35 program goes, etc. Editions of magazines that are Canadian edition will be missing an article that's in the international or the U.S. edition, and it relates specifically to the Canadian Armed Forces. That's a two-way street. Canada wants to maintain a process to regulate anti-dumping and countervailing disputes, like the one over softwood lumber. The U.S. wants to get rid of Chapter 19 that was basically created over softwood lumber. It may be modified. It is unlikely that it disappears altogether. So Canada certainly has more to talk about than Mexico. There's no doubt about that. But, as the numbers show, hey, what exactly has Mexico got to be so pissed off about? Not a whole lot. Interesting article you just sent me there, Penny. I'll have to look at that later. We're going to talk about a couple other Michael Geist articles coming up there. So that's what everybody's after. Mexico is just like, can't we just all get along? Canada says, well, we're still not going to change this. You're still not getting into our dairy market. You're still not screwing up the way we do business. We still want to be able to make environmental laws. And the U.S. just says, be like us. I mean, this has been in the news for, 7 months now. Trump was talking about playing with NAFTA basically right after he got into office, so everybody knew this was coming. So, everybody's had a lot of time to work up for it. We go back to June of 2017, a piece here from Michael Geist. U.S. lobbies are attacking Canada, trying to get their changes that they want more palatable in the public venue. U.S. lobby groups take aim at Canadian copyright law and NAFTA. They want no balance provisions, no fair use provisions, and no cultural exceptions. Of course, this would be based on that list that the U.S. put out. Now, what Professor Geist says, while some IP stakeholders, such as the Business Software Association, are supportive of safe harbors, most others hope to use NAFTA to require significant reforms process and then impose those changes on Canada and Mexico. For example, the RIAA, Recording Industry Association of America, wants Canada to drop the notice and notice system, which is used for copyright infringement currently, and it wants reform of the U.S. notice and takedown system. Beef that up, and they want that to be the rules for NAFTA. Now, the MPAA, the Motion Picture Association of America, cautions against simply using the DMCA as the standard. That's not enough. Of course, DMCA is the takedown of content that is deemed to be in copyright violation. It can also lead to seizure of websites, prosecution of website owners, etc. Now, the MPAA has a real problem with the cultural protection, saying that they should be just removed from NAFTA. NAFTA is the only U.S. trade agreement currently in force that includes a cultural carve-out. Such a carve-out is inconsistent with the principles of free and fair trade. Cultural promotion and open markets are compatible and complementary. MPAA is committed to the promotion and protection of cultural diversity and firmly believes that NAFTA parties in the modernization negotiations can effectively rely on the flexibilities built into free trade agreements, including permissible support programs to promote their cultural interests. What that translates to me, is along the lines of Disney making the movie Pocahontas. That's what they're looking for. Canada has long maintained the need for a cultural exception in its trade agreements. And while the TPP opened the door to exceptions, the MPAA wants it gone altogether. The MPAA also wants Canada to extend the term of copyright to life of the author plus 70 years, plus from the current standard found in the Berne Convention, which is life of the author plus 50 years. It argues that the extension of the term of protection for copyrighted works has a direct benefit to the creators of these works as well as consumers. And what they don't mention is that, the creators are long since dead. Consumers are facing higher prices with the extension, and that the change would lock down the Canadian public domain for 2 decades. No thanks. This is what the so-called, business community is contributing to the debate. But it's happening in our own backyard as well. September 22nd, once more, Michael Geist. Bell calls for a CRTC-backed website blocking system and complete criminalization of copyright in a new NAFTA. Bell, Canada's largest telecom company, has called on the government to support radical copyright and broadcast distribution reforms as part of the NAFTA renegotiation. The proposals include the creation of a mandated website blocking system without judicial review, overseen by the CRTC, and the complete criminalization of copyright, with criminal provisions attached to all commercial infringement. Bell also supports an overhaul of the current retransmission system for broadcasters, supporting a consent model that would either keep U.S. channels out of the Canadian market or dramatically increase their cost of access while maintaining simultaneous substitution. So if you want to watch the original channel out of the States that a program's on, Bell wants the Canadian government to block them. You have to watch their station that's playing it in Canada. This hearing that Bell brought up these indeed radical proposals, Rogers also testified. Compared to Bell, they took a reasonable balance. The 2012 Copyright Modernization Act was carefully developed by Parliament over many years and is designed to serve the interests of all Canadians in its balance between rights holders and uses of copyrighted works. We are concerned that a trade renegotiation, where copyright issues are used as bargaining chips, could endanger this delicate balance. In our view, any changes to our domestic copyright laws should be made through the upcoming 5-year review of the Copyright Modernization Act, not through the NAFTA renegotiation. In other words, Rogers believes that changes to Canadian copyright law should come through an open public process, not behind closed doors at a trade negotiation. Now, I would have to stand with that. It's pretty sad when you're siding with Rogers, but it's over Bell. But by contrast, Bell took precisely the opposite approach, urging the government to use secretive trade discussions to establish copyright reforms that would be unlikely to ever garner public or policy support. Indeed, it seems like the only way Canada could end up with a mandated website blocking system overseen by the CRTC would be to cook it up in a trade negotiation. Bell focused on piracy during its presentation, arguing that website blocking is the best solution. In our view, it would be an independent agency that would be charged with that task. You certainly would not want ISPs acting as censors as to what content is pirated content. But surely an independent third-party agency could be formed, could create a blacklist of pirate sites, and then the ISPs would be required to block it. That is, at a high level, how we would see it unfolding. What bullshit. Absolute bullshit. Well, we don't want to run it. We just want to make the rules. And then when it ends up in court, when somebody's going to get sued for blocking, well, we don't want it to be us just because it was our idea. It'd be best if you guys set up a committee because you're the government. So, you can go to court for carrying our water. Bell would like the CRTC to police allegations of copyright infringement by overseeing a new website blocking agency charged with creating a block list. Incredibly, Bell's proposal involves no court oversight, hoping to create a mandatory system for blocking websites that excludes the due process that comes from judicial review. Notably, Bell does not discuss that Canada already has a provision in the Copyright Act that allows right holders to target websites that enable infringement. As if that's not enough, Bell also wants to introduce criminal liability for all commercial copyright infringement. Mr. Geist sums it up by saying Bell's copyright advocacy goes beyond what even some U.S. rights holders have called for, envisioning new methods of using copyright law to police the internet with oversight from the CRTC and implementing such provisions through NAFTA. So, you think Trump and his cronies want to screw us on a new NAFTA? That's what Bell wants to do in Canada. Who else has had something to say that shouldn't necessarily be listened to? Oh, I know. How about Stephen Harper? October 27th. Former Prime Minister was in New York after being in Washington, and he said he was worried by what he heard when he discussed NAFTA at an event, but did not publicly share his misgivings about the Trudeau government. Harper said, "I fear that the NAFTA renegotiation is going very badly. I also believe that President Trump's threat to terminate NAFTA is not a bluff. I believe this threat is real. Therefore, Canada's government needs to get its head around this reality. It does not matter whether current American proposals are worse than what we have now. What matters in evaluating them and whether it is worth having a trade agreement with the Americans or not." Minister Freeland described Harper's position as capitulation. I would tend to agree with that. When asked for comment, Lisa Raitt, Conservative deputy leader, said that the former Prime Minister was just putting his thoughts down and that a lot of people agree with him. Yeah, a lot. Especially all them ones on Bay Street and Park Ave, K Street. They all agree with him. Raitt said he's just putting his point of view forward on how to approach it and what he would be advising if he were in the spot. And I think it's very valid for him to do that. Sure you do. Thanks for coming out, Lisa. There's been a lot in the press about where the negotiations are going, even when they're not happening. I guess that's bound to happen. You're not seeing nearly as much on American media about NAFTA as you are on Canadian media. Even Mexican media does not have the coverage that Canada has. What do unions have to say about it in Canada? Well, Jerry Diaz is the leader of Unifor, Canada's largest private sector union. In his opinion, walking away from NAFTA negotiations would likely give the Liberal government a popularity boost among Canadian workers. Gary Diaz said if Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland quit the negotiating table over the troubled deal, they'd get a pat on the back from Canadians on the shop floor. Well, that seems a little simple, if you ask me. You know, I think by the time we're done here, what's going to be demonstrated is this is almost like being on life support at the hospital. You can't disconnect one part of the system. Something else is going to go wrong. Something else is going to fail. Somebody else is going to pay the price. It's been 23 years. And as I said off the top, there are a lot of goods that are made by NAFTA. They're not made by the United States. They're made by Canada. They may be assembled in one of those three countries, but all three countries have a place in the supply chain. So think about not only trade within NAFTA, what about exports to the rest of the world? Now, this is where Trump's bluster comes in, because the U.S. cannot carry that on, even if they are the point of export. Without the parts from Canada and Mexico, they can't put the shit together to sell it. So again, it's Trump with his big mouth. Now, one comment came from University of Toronto political science professor Nelson Wiseman. He said, Trump is a narcissist and is really only interested in being able to brag he has a deal. The guy seems totally uninterested in content. For him, it's the projection that he's done something, and thus it should be popular. Well, I would have to agree with that. But things have been moving on. The rounds of negotiations have been happening. But the scare tactics are only intensifying. December 11th, 2017, Goldman Sachs, those that control nations, ask Greece. Goldman Sachs has said that they see it as very likely that Donald Trump will withdraw from the accord. And come the meetings that are going to happen in Montreal this week, we're going to see it all blow up. In a note to their clients, they said, a withdrawal announcement looks more likely than not, even if tax reform is enacted soon. So there they are, giving a nod to what a lot of people are saying. Trump just wants something to hold up with his gaudy signature on. Look what I did. It's a great deal because I did it. God. The things Goldman brought attention to, this would cause a disruption in currency markets. It's expected the peso would dive against the dollar. Strength of the peso has been a problem over the past year or two. Now, there is opposition within the United States as well. Douglas Holtz-Eakin, president of the American Action Forum and a former chief economist of the Council of Economic Advisors under George W. Bush, said that many of the U.S. proposals are so clearly non-starters for our NAFTA partners, that it doesn't seem like they're moving forward that much. Now, the forum published information in December in the United States. It said a NAFTA withdrawal would jeopardize 14 million U.S. jobs and cost American consumers at least $7 billion. So what is the point? Goldman's predictions are the Mexican peso may drop to 20 pesos per US dollar as a minimum if negotiations go bad, and the Canadian dollar may slump further to make an American dollar worth $1.35. Goldman's basis for this prediction was the fact remains that the sides are far apart on issues where we struggle to see an obvious middle ground. Again, not mentioning the orange elephant in the room. January 10th this year. Rumors of a termination letter from President Trump. Now that would start the 6-month exit clock ticking. What is it? Article 2205, I believe. I can't remember offhand. It's here somewhere. Now, would that mean, if this happened, would that mean at the end of 6 months that that's it? No. The United States would not be legally bound to quit once that 6-month window expires. Sending a termination letter would allow Trump, who's been frustrated with Mexican and Canadian reluctance to meet aggressive U.S. demands on the sourcing of automotive parts and on dispute settlement, to take a key step toward meeting his campaign promise of quitting NAFTA if it cannot be revised to shrink U.S. trade deficit. Now, Gary Huffbauer, the senior fellow and trade expert at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, said Trump can gain political mileage out of a big announcement to quit NAFTA without actually, there's no deal after 2 more scheduled negotiating rounds coming up right away in January, and in March, NAFTA talks would be put on hold for several months as Mexico's presidential election campaign gets underway. Again, this is the election campaign where the opposition leader, Lamo, who is polling ahead of Peña Nieto and has said he's not down with these type of agreements. So is there any pressure to get it done before then? Well, depends who you ask. Now, NAFTA's Article 2205 states, a party may withdraw from this agreement 6 months after it provides written notice of withdrawal to the other parties. If a party withdraws, the agreement shall remain in force for the remaining parties. Well, that's kind of deceptive because, they said that that's not enough to end the agreement. Just saying we quit. It's not that simple. There are law changes. Congress has to get involved. So again, the narcissist king insists that he's in control of everything, but he's not. The more time that goes by, the more of the Republican House that Trump is sure to lose on any withdrawal from NAFTA. Why? As I said, all those red states where the number one export market is Canada. January 11th, Donald Trump's top deal makers are said to be complaining that Canada is not negotiating, and that in the event of a collapse of the North American Free Trade Agreement, a bilateral deal with Mexico might be easier than one with Canada because it is willing to be flexible on U.S. content requirements. Well, is that based in fact compared to what we've seen so far? No, but it sounds good. The counter from government officials in Canada were that the idea that NAFTA is in trouble because of 2 chapters out of 28 is total nonsense. As of last week, the Trudeau government said they have no intention of stepping away from a Indigenous chapter and an environmental chapter. Those will be part of a new NAFTA come hell or high water at this point from the Canadian perspective. There are issues that the Canadian team has said are non-starters for them, flat out. The 5-year sunset clause, scrapping of Chapter 19, the upped U.S. content in automobiles, the end of supply management, and the opening up of Canadian government procurement. In my opinion, especially supply management and government procurement, we're just not a big enough market to compete with the United States. It's bad enough now with P3s doing highway maintenance, and look at the mess with Chretien going bankrupt. We don't need more of this. Now, Trump would like to see an 85% component ratio in automobiles being sourced from within the NAFTA region. 50% of the content coming from the U.S. Now, that's just too far. It's currently 65. And even Jerry Diaz, president of Unifor, which basically, has a lot to do with the car industry in Canada, says 85 is out of the question, but we could go to 75. So it's not like things are impossible here. Progress is possible on the sunset clause if it's watered down into an agreement to hold periodic reviews. The demand to scrap Chapter 19 dispute resolution remains non-negotiable on the Canadian side, but there is possibility for reform of Chapter 11 ISDS. Now, this is the question. If Trump wants to withdraw, Congress can block it. As things unwind day by day in the Trump universe, it's more likely. It's more likely. What would happen to consumers? Well, prices would rise marginally. Industries such as transportation equipment, cars, clothing, food and beverages would be impacted adversely. There are those that say that Canada could adjust fairly quickly with not much downside. Well, I guess that depends on where you sit. We've heard this before, have we not, people? It's been brought up. People have mentioned to me the last couple of days, there's word of this topic is getting out. What would happen? Would we go back to the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement from 1988? Well, not necessarily. Now, Sarah Goldfader is a former U.S. diplomat in Mexico and Canada who's following the trade negotiations at Earnscliffe Strategy Group in Ottawa. This comes from a column by Alexander Panetta, Canadian Press. She said that's naive. You would have to re-implement the original agreement. That would raise new challenges. First of all, the current American political climate would not make for an easy re-implementation. She said there would be demands for a renegotiation from the United States, and we'd be right back at the table if NAFTA can't be worked out. There's no way this administration would do this re-implementation without negotiating a new agreement. That may be the biggest issue. Suspension of the old agreement was signaled in diplomatic notes exchanged between the countries. The 1993 notes were brief and vaguely worded. The countries complimented each other on their new deal with Mexico and confirmed that each would make separate arrangements to suspend the old deal. Now, the American suspension is in Section 107 of the law implementing NAFTA in 1994. Now, the earlier Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, negotiated by Brian Mulroney and Ronald Reagan, was to be suspended, and according to the law, it would remain suspended until such time as that suspension may be terminated. It doesn't define how you terminate a suspension. So someone has to unsuspend it to allow it to be put back into force. That someone could be the U.S. Congress. Now, even if Congress did successfully vote to reintroduce the old free trade agreement, that vote would either require the approval of the president or a two-thirds majority in Congress to overcome a veto. Now, Washington trade experts said lawmakers could also try sneaking bits of trade legislation into larger bills. American lawmakers would likely expect a vote on any free trade agreement re-implementation. And Canadians are being warned from Washington that it's a dangerous complacency that there's some insurance policy if NAFTA dies. It may be the only game in town. Now, what happens if Trump uses Section 2205? Well, there are quite a few scenarios that could happen. NAFTA survives, at least for a while. This again is from Alexander Panetta, January 11th. The agreement's withdrawal clause is not an automatic exit trigger. It's not like Brexit and the EU's Article 50. This Article 2205 requires 6 months' notice before a pullout can happen. The loonie will drop. Goldman Sachs says a 6-cent drop in the Canadian dollar if Trump announces a NAFTA pullout, and an even more dramatic effect on the peso. Lawsuit watch. A debate is already raging within the American legal community about the constitutionality of a president pulling out of a trade agreement without an act of Congress. Some say the president has the authority, others say he does not. What everyone does agree on is the likelihood of lawsuits. The U.S. Constitution gives the president power over international relations, but Congress has power over international trade. There's very little precedent for this sort of case in the United States. If Trump withdraws, Mexico will probably walk away. The Mexicans have said this publicly, and sources say they have been even more explicit about it in private. Canada will likely stay at the table. Then what does Trump do next? Does he pause negotiations during the Mexican elections? Well, I don't see how he's going to have much choice. Then he has to wait for a new Mexican president. That's the issue of suspending the NAFTA negotiations now. If the Mexican polls hold the way they're looking through the election, Peña Nieto will not be back. There will be a new president who has a much different view on trade and a much different view of the United States. That's the risk Trump runs by grandstanding and withdrawing. Absolutely nothing happens. I mean, until, if there are businesses that are doing business across borders every day of the year, they're making money, they have a business model, they've been doing it for who knows how long. The 6 months is up, there's been no word, nothing's happened, keep doing it. You know, again, I'd like to stress that this question in chat. What's this guy from Mexico like? How is he different? Who's that? Is that the current president Peña Nieto or the challenger? The challenger has been compared to Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela. Yeah, the new guy. Yeah, he's to the left. He's the leader of the main opposition party. He's been polling in front for quite a while. It doesn't mean anything. It's not election day. That's the only poll that really matters. But it does affect the negotiations. You want to deal with this guy, you want to deal with maybe the other guy in 6 months. Well, he's riding a wave of popularism after his election win. A lot of things at play. Now, what did Freeland have to say about all the Article 2205 talk this week? Well, she said that it's not necessarily the end of the line. I think there is a lot of uncertainty about what would happen in that 6-month period. This would be the first time that the United States has actually withdrawn from a free trade agreement. There's a lot of uncertainty about what would actually happen. Well, I agree. No doubt. Again, this is what the American press has been saying. Those Canadians are being too cagey. They're not telling us anything. Well, where the hell should we? As far as the American bluster goes and the support for Trump's bizarre perspective, according to Speaker of the House Paul Ryan, the real problem with NAFTA is Canada, not Mexico. Well, not according to Trump, but okay. Ryan said that the free trade agreement would risk higher tariffs for cheese that American producers export to Mexico. Okay. Dairy has long been one of the sticking points in Canada-U.S. trade, especially for Ryan's native Wisconsin. Canada's system of tariffs and quotas, known as supply management, restricts much of its market. The U.S. is proposing in NAFTA talks to blow up that system, but the Canadians argue the U.S. still has a leg up. In a letter last year sent to the governors of New York and Wisconsin, the Canadian ambassador to Washington, David McNaughton, cited data showing dairy trade between the countries benefited the U.S. by a 5-to-1 margin. Well, I guess Paul Ryan tells the truth to the same degree on just about everything. But as we get closer to the Montreal meetings, what's been changing? Canada has been softening its stance. Foreign Affairs Minister, this is from Thomas Walcom in the Toronto Star, January 15th. Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland set the table last week when she told reporters that Ottawa has come up with creative ideas for dealing with the impasse in the three-way talks. One would gut portions of the agreement that allow independent panels to rule on disputed trade and economic policies. Another would require autos imported to the U.S. from Canada and Mexico to contain at least 50% American content, the government procurement rules, and the sunset clause. All of these Canada called deal breakers. And at the time, to the irritation of the Americans, refused to provide counterproposals. This was around the time Stephen Harper made his comments. It's been reported that Canada will propose technical changes to auto content rules in order to mollify the Americans. And Canada is mulling over proposals to change 3 dispute settlement chapters in order to make them more acceptable. Again, we come to the different levels of understanding on the practices, on the challenges. Chapter 19 is about countervailing and dumping. It's basically company against company on different sides of the border. That's Chapter 19. Canada loves that chapter. The Americans hate it. Canada has said a deal without Chapter 19 would be pointless. Now, Chapter 11 is the ISDS. It's been used successfully several times against Canada. But every time ISDS has been attempted against the U.S., it has failed. Now, the Americans want to give governments the right to opt out of Chapter 11, but the Canadians want to keep everybody in on Chapter 11. Nobody seems to understand that, but that's how it is. And there are people that are questioning that now. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives says that Chapter 11 provisions in NAFTA have cost Canada $95 million in unrecoverable legal fees. The CCPA says Canadian losses through Chapter 11 amount to $314 million when the legal fees are added to the $219 million in awards and settlements under ISDS. The current renegotiation opens the door to get rid of, or at least neutralize, the ISDS mechanism in NAFTA, and I certainly think Canada should grasp that opportunity. I do think negotiators and the government are weighing their options, because the U.S. administration wants to make ISDS optional. While a lot of the Trump administration's proposals in the NAFTA talks are harmful to Canadian interests, this one is beneficial. So, what's the reluctance? I do not know. I do not know. We shall see. The next meetings are coming up in Montreal. I don't know. I mean, Mexico is definitely the big winner in NAFTA. Canada has had some refocusing of its labor markets, to put it mildly. But again, I say with the hindsight of these 20 plus years now, how much of the manufacturing job losses would have happened anyway through automation, through downsizing? True, I do believe that NAFTA allowed for the basically sellout and dismantlement of Canadian aerospace, which Paul Martin was so happy to enable. But would they have been put out of business by the American companies anyway, instead of being absorbed by them? I don't know. I don't know what to say. Thanks, everybody in chat. I wish I could have paid more attention to you. Sorry. But thanks for coming out. And thanks for talking. You guys know what the hell's going on there. Familiar crowd, good to see you. That's about it. Wrap it up a couple minutes early. NAFTA or no NAFTA. I think that all three countries are tied to this thing. Our economies have become too interdependent for too big a piece of our revenue. And of course, the country or the corporations that we harbor have a lot to do with that. But this is the playing field we're on. So we'll see what happens. An awful lot being said about it. It was time I did a show on it. I did it. I hope to part with learning who are on the teams, who these people are, what experience they have. It'll help a bit, give a little background to it. We'll see what happens in Montreal. Of course, I hope Canada sticks to its guns. But at this point in time, my personal opinion is it would be better for the agreement to go on with no alternative in sight. The devil you know is better than the invisible devil. That's my point. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Going to wrap up the show. Get the hell out of here in 2 hours. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week on The View Up Here. Good night.